Welcome everyone to the 5th edition of the Electric Truck Bootcamp. As you can see on your screens, today we're talking incentives for electrification. Money, 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 basically. And if Stephanie, you could go to the next slide. As a reminder, the Electric Truck Bootcamp is part of the lead up to Run on Less Electric this fall, where we have these 13 fleets you can see on your screen from across North America participating to share data and lessons learned from their real-world electric truck deployments. Our team at NACFE and RMI are actually out visiting each of these participants over about the next month or so. So look for some introductory participant profile videos to hit that Run on Less website later on in August. I'm actually broadcasting live today from Velocity Truck Centers, one of the leading alternative fuel truck dealers in the continent. So very excited to be out on the road again and just getting to see a lot of these vehicles in operation, as well as hear from some of these other partners in the ecosystem like the dealers around what really is going on with electric trucks. And if we can go to the next slide, I'm also excited to share with everyone that NACFE is hitting the road again. Now that folks are vaccinated and things are opening back up, I'm excited to share we'll be at each of these shows this fall. It's going to be a very busy September for the Run on Less Electric team. So if you have plans to attend any of these shows, we invite you to join us at our booth or at some of these at the workshops that we'll be hosting on electric trucks if you want to dive deeper on the topics that we're covering through this boot camp, for example. And if you're not already signed up for NACFE's newsletter, I would encourage you to do so. It's the best way to stay in touch and figure out where we're going to be. If we go to the next slide, just a reminder that Run on Less Electric is officially kicking off at ACT Expo this fall. If you would like to join us there is a discount code on your screen. If you're not registered yet, I encourage you to do that soon. We'll also be hosting a workshop at ACT Expo to talk through a lot of these themes that we're hearing throughout the boot camp, as well as what we're learning from these participant visits. So we hope you can join us there. If you can go to the next screen, just a reminder, the Electric Truck Boot Camp is a 10-part training series. We are now on number 5 of 10. I don't know about you guys, but it is flying by for us. We've already covered kind of what's driving electric trucks, as well as most, if not all, of the questions we could get to on charging, whether it's hardware or software, as well as why and how fleets should think about working with their utility for electrification. And something that's come up through probably all of our boot camps so far is the fact that although there are clear reasons driving the adoption of electric trucks, they are still more expensive than a traditional diesel vehicle today. And so for that reason, we are going to focus today on what incentives are out there, what's available to help fleets and their partners who are thinking about advancing this technology, really get it out into the real world. Next slide. So just some quick housekeeping before we get started. So if you have questions, we will have time for Q&A at the end. So I encourage you to type those out into the Q&A box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. I want to remind folks that a recording of today's webinar will be available on runonless.com as well as on ACT News. So you can watch it as much as you'd like after the fact, as well as the previous 4 bootcamp sessions. And then just a quick reminder, there will be a survey at the end. We would love any feedback you're able to share. And lastly, if you do experience any technical issues, please use the contact info on your screen. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the fact of the matter is electric trucks do cost more in today's market than a traditional diesel vehicle. And for this reason, there are a variety of different incentives out there to help fleets and their partners really get these trucks on the road and into operation. And these can take a variety of forms, these options on the screen: grants, rebates, vouchers, tax credits. We're going to hear about a lot of these today, and there are certainly more that we won't have time to touch on today, but just to be clear, there are a lot of different opportunities out there. And the good news, if you can go to the next screen, is that there is over $500 million available in the U.S. alone in public funding for electric trucks. So again, a lot of money out there to really help fleets who want to deploy this technology to be successful and have the resources to do so. Next slide. Just a quick note that there are also a lot of resources to help connect folks with this funding and help better understand what those options are depending on your geography, the specific zero-emission vehicle type that you're looking for, different models. I've put a few on the screen here, some from our friends at CalSTART and ACT News. We also recommend that fleets wanting to learn about incentives that make sense for them, talk with their local clean cities coalitions and or your local utility. You may know more, especially on the infrastructure side. So with that, I think we're going to jump in. If we can go to the next slide, we've got a great group of experts here who are going to talk us through a variety of different incentives that are available, kind of how they came to be, how they function, and how fleets, OEMs, partners should really be thinking about how to use these incentives to maximize the value of electric trucks. So without further ado, we're going to jump into our first speaker, Victoria Carey from the New Jersey Economic Development Authority. Victoria is going to tell us a bit about why incentives are really necessary, as well as an exciting pilot program that they're doing in the Garden State. So over to you, Victoria.
Thanks so much, Jesse. As Jesse noted, I'm representing the New Jersey Economic Development Authority, and we're a group tasked with fostering innovation in New Jersey and are a partner in New Jersey's portion of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative work. And if you're unfamiliar with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, it's a multi-state carbon auction sort of group that is focused, at least in our case, we selected to focus on zero emission vehicles, with EDA specifically focusing on medium and heavy duty vehicles as a big driver and need in the business communities. So as relevant today, I'm going to be speaking to that work that we've been doing, as well as looking at our programs that we've launched so far and are considering and could consider in the future around a voucher program, sort of using it as a case study. So you can go to the next slide. I won't belabor the points here, but sort of at the end of the day, the whole goal of this slide is to outline why we're doing this work at all. Why are we trying to incentivize these vehicles? So, we're not just trying to create healthier and safer communities and improve the environment by supporting zero emission vehicle adoption and zero emission transportation more generally. We're also supporting the massive transformative growth in one of the largest sectors of the economy, transportation. We don't get to any of the zero emission transportation emission reduction goals, which are sort of a driving force, by just buying a bunch of trucks. You also have to create an ecosystem, a grid, a workforce, a policy and a regulatory framework that supports that adoption and supports the people and the businesses making that transition from fossil fuel vehicles to zero emission vehicles, folks like yourselves. And creating that ecosystem isn't a small task. It's not easy work. And that's why it's great to work with partners across state lines in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, for instance, as well as with partners at NACFE and others in industry, in government, and in our communities. So you can go to the next slide. So if we get all these fantastic, wonderful things from zero emission vehicles, why do we even need incentives? We're going to get healthier, vibrant communities. We're going to improve our businesses. We're going to create and stimulate the economy. Well, the acceleration of adoption is a key goal. So yeah, they may make their way into our system eventually, but if we look at sort of this first bullet point here, the equipment lifespans mean that if we don't accelerate adoption now, that there's a really long tail to get those benefits. So if you're buying a diesel vehicle today, you might not retire it for 15 years. And even if you retire it, you might sell it to a secondhand market, and then it'll be in use for another 15 years. So if we're really looking to get those economic and environment and health benefits, we want to start as soon as possible and accelerate that adoption rather than just waiting for prices to fall. And as I mentioned, price, that is a big barrier to entry. So it's kind of this catch-22, sort of the rest of these pieces. There's a high upfront cost to purchasing an electric truck today. And the manufacturers of those trucks are saying, hey, we can reduce costs as soon as we get volume in orders. So once the demand is there, we can reduce cost, but the demand won't be there until the costs reduce. sort of the next item here is that there's a lack of sufficient charging infrastructure for especially cross-country long-haul sort of transportation of goods and people across the US, for example, or North America. But there's also high power applications that require a significant amount of power and access to ready chargers. And so again, it's this sort of chicken and the egg issues where utilities are saying, hey, I can't make a rate case, I can't add capacity to my grid, I'm not going to do all this make-ready work unless you prove to me that there's demand for these vehicles. And there won't be demand for the vehicles until there's a charging infrastructure to support them. The next bullet point is just sort of this longer term issue that takes just a lot of time and effort to think through, which is that we don't know at the end of life necessarily what the value of these vehicles are. Right now, there's a very well understood end of life value to vehicles that are powered by diesel or gasoline. But battery electric vehicles don't necessarily have that clarity. There are a few other items here that I won't go into detail in, but long story short is that the whole goal of incentives is to break this sort of catch-22 cycle where folks are waiting for things to drop in price or waiting for access, and we want to just jumpstart that by incentivizing lowering that incremental cost of the vehicles, the incremental cost being the cost difference between a zero-emission vehicle and a gas or diesel alternative. And so we can make that progress that we need, and we can accelerate that progress. So you can go to the next slide. So there's a lot of words on this page. I'm not going to be able to dive into all of them, but this is an example of some of the things that need to be considered and developed and implemented to foster the zero emission ecosystem, and incentives are a huge part of that. So I've got these three sort of sections. So we're talking about accelerating the adoption of the vehicles themselves. We're talking about modernizing the grid infrastructure so it can handle the additional zero emission vehicles that are charging up. And we're talking about supporting people and businesses in that economy that's created around zero emission vehicles and supporting that growth and development of the skill sets and infrastructure that folks need within their businesses. So, just to flag a few things here, on the left-hand side, tax incentives, we've got tax credits. We've got sales tax that can be used as an incentive, perhaps reducing or removing and exempting folks from sales tax who are buying zero-emission vehicles. We've got, just by the nature of zero-emission vehicles being not based on gas, if you have a gas tax in your state, you can have that as an incentive. There are grants and vouchers and rebates, things where you don't have to pay back the money. It's not necessarily based on taxes, it's just cash in hand. And the difference between these are sometimes when you get them and if you experience the upfront costs versus if you get paid back later. There's financing or secondhand programs, so opportunities to reach people where they're at, folks who are not necessarily just purchasing vehicles outright. There are non-financial incentives like access to HOV lanes, so you can lower those soft costs of waiting in traffic with your vehicle. And then there's regulations and standards that can come into play and accelerate adoption, sort of looking at carrot versus stick options here. On the right-hand side, there's a bunch of incentive structures and regulatory and policy structures that can support grid modernization. So again, speaking to financing, there's infrastructure financing and make-ready support that can help to reduce that sort of unknown cost of the infrastructure upgrades that utilities will have to make to accommodate these vehicles. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the support for people and businesses in the green economy, although it's something I'm passionate about within the EDA. And we're going to transition in this next slide, if you go ahead, into NJZIP, which is our zero emission incentive program. And it's our pilot program for that's in a voucher style. So we're doing it as a first come, first serve voucher pilot program. Incentive programs, the goal there is to reduce the upfront cost of vehicles to purchasers. So rather than a rebate where you might buy a vehicle and receive money back later, or a tax incentive where you would apply and receive a discount on your taxes, the goal here is to reduce that upfront cost because we recognize that incremental cost between a gas vehicle and a zero emission alternative is really a huge barrier. So our particular pilot program, we're starting it with $15 million, setting aside money for small businesses because we recognize that they have potentially more difficulty applying for these types of programs. And with vouchers ranging for medium duty vehicles, so classes 2B through class 6, from $25,000 to $100,000 with additional stackable bonuses on top of that. So if you go to the next slide. So, that's just the nuts and bolts of what the program is. But what have we actually learned from it, and how might you be able to implement a similar program in your state? So I'll show you on the next slide just very briefly. We did a baselining and cross comparison with other voucher programs that have existed or still exist. So this is just a quick cross comparison slide that shows you voucher amounts and how they're formatted. But if you just go back one slide, the four things that I just wanted to touch on are kind of quick learnings, or four things here. So one, we designed this program because the upfront costs of zero emission vehicles are too high for folks. And we're learning that, this is an effective tool. People are really appreciating it, but it's not necessarily reaching every community that we want to reach. So even though there are bonuses in place for women, minority, and veteran-owned businesses, there are bonuses in place for small businesses. Some of them are still struggling with the purchasing mechanism. So we're looking at financing options, lease options, pre-owned vehicle options, and repower and retrofit options. These are things that you could consider to integrate into a program you design. Environmental justice communities, in our case, we're really looking at the immediacy of the solutions that they need. So in that case, for our pilot program, we're focusing on medium duty vehicles because they're less of a load on the grid. They're more readily and rapidly available for communities. But we recognize that the heavy duty sector is one of the highest polluting sectors. And so we want to look at that sector. We want to expand beyond the pilot communities that we selected, and figuring out if we can support particular use cases like school buses that have very specialized need sets that are different than trucks, for instance. And then the last 2 points here, there's limited charging infrastructure available. We're recognizing that that's just a piece that's not in our voucher program, and so opportunities to support charging infrastructure. And then finally, support structures in any state that hasn't already rolled out these types of vehicle. We are trying to support that and push towards that by requiring in-state servicing, requiring a standard warranty and support setup. But what you really need is in-state knowledge and technical expertise. So looking at how do we attract and support businesses that are here, and how do we also educate and prepare the workforce to install these charging stations? They already have the electrical expertise, they already have the construction expertise. How do we make companies feel confident and comfortable that folks can install these things appropriately, manage them, and perform maintenance? So that's my very quick run through of NJZIP and some incentive design thoughts. And I'll pass it back over to you, Jessie.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Very exciting to hear what you guys put together there. I hope anyone who's on the line who might be operating medium-duty trucks in New Jersey can take advantage of that program. I encourage you to just Google NJZIP and see if it makes sense for you. Also very interesting to see that comparison you've done of all of these programs. And just a reminder, all the slides will be available after the training today as well. So don't worry about scribbling all of this down for all of the different vehicle types. All right, Victoria, we'll come back to you at the end with some Q&A. But up next, we're going to talk with Kyle Winslow from CalSTART, who's going to tell us a little bit more about what's happening at the federal level and how that can complement some of these initiatives at the state level. Kyle, over to you.
Thanks, Jessie. Thanks for the invitation, and great to be with everyone today. Kyle Winslow, Federal Policy Director at CalSTART. CalSTART is a national nonprofit based in California, but we have a national footprint with over 270 members in the clean transportation space, a lot of folks in the medium heavy duty vehicle space, and a lot of fleets in that space as well. So trying to give everyone a little bit of perspective from our vantage point, and working with those members and with the industry on what's happening in DC, a little bit on incentives for zero emission trucks and buses. So if we can go to the next slide here, just starting with a little bit of a calibration, it's a good visual of what we call the beachhead strategy, which is essentially how in California CARB has, and now other states have been thinking a little bit about the progress of zero emission medium heavy duty vehicles through early stages of commercialization. So you can see here kind of a quick snapshot of some examples of what we would think of as different quote unquote waves of technologies coming online based on a number of different factors. For example, so we see wave one, we have transit buses because of established routes, the charging infrastructure and depoting that's there. Also, frankly, significant federal subsidies that are there to support. Those technologies have moved out quickly, and they also provide a pathway for other waves, so to speak, in the beachhead to progress technology transfer and so on into different waves of shuttle bus or delivery van technologies, medium duty, heavy regional haul, and then long haul. And so I think this just shows in particular two different things. One is that we're going to be progressing in technology over time, and that these same technologies underpinning earlier waves are going to be enabling the later technologies. But also it speaks to just the general phased approach here that we're going to see in commercial vehicles in general as they decarbonize. That's not all going to happen at once. And I think a big part of that is obviously cost, as Victoria was kind of just pointing out. Next slide, please. We'll kind of talk a little bit more about that. And so incremental costs, as Victoria had mentioned too, obviously that difference between zero emission truck and the ICE truck, the gas or diesel equivalent, is a big barrier, obviously, for fleets that are just trying to dip their toes into zero emission commercial vehicles. And so what we wanted to kind of talk about here was point of sale programs or cash purchase incentives. So the vouchers were example given in the last New Jersey VIP example for medium duty, and that's one example of a point of sale type program. And so significant upfront costs, you want to try to buy them down so that fleets have confidence in their purchase decision. They can see the total cost of ownership pencil out. All things equal, that upfront cost barrier, if you can address, say 80% of that incremental cost, like some of these point of sale programs have done at the state level, that gives the fleet operator confidence to make the purchase. And really important, as these vehicles are obviously in early stages of commercialization. It's not like a light duty EV where folks are more confident with those technologies and with the price and with the charging requirements. It's a learning curve here. So providing that kind of targeted incentive towards incremental cost, but also coupling that with cash on the hood or a monetization of that incentive. So not necessarily like a tax credit or where you claim it at the end of the filing period, or a rebate that's a post-purchase kind of incentive on the hood, so that a fleet operator can see what they're going to be getting. It's very clear in terms of what that truck, based on the class and duty cycle they're looking for, what they qualify for, when they'll be able to capture that incentive, and when funds become available, first come, first serve, or when that period is open and closed. And so another good point here is that monetization really helps out the bulk of smaller fleets too. So folks operating around margins, and in a lot of cases without the headroom to be able to put out upfront capital to purchase a lot of these trucks and deploy them. So the monetization of an incentive can really spur the majority of U.S. fleet carriers that are operating under six or fewer trucks. We just had a great example of the New Jersey Voucher Program that Victoria mentioned. Another one is the Hybrid and Zero Emission Voucher Incentive Project out of California, which has been the oldest and the largest program to really create a market in California and do that pretty successfully. And so states are moving out on point of sale programs in a great way. There is a risk to having a patchwork approach. Obviously, we want to have the most aggressive policies across the board so that we can decarbonize freight and goods movement and people movement across the board. And so that's kind of leading into our next discussion on federal incentives. But why are we doing this in general? point of sale programs and targeting that incremental cost, if done well, can increase the rate of deployments, and that can obviously bend down the commercial vehicle emissions curve quite aggressively, and including for frontline communities. That ACT program, California, for example, I think over 60% of those funds are targeted right towards frontline communities. Not only do you have the general benefit of lowering, NOx, other GHGs, particulate matter, but you can tie incentives in some cases to where these trucks are deployed or domiciled or garaged, and so that can benefit frontline communities directly, and also, supporting a purchase incentive that really helps deployments. Obviously, bolsters the supply chain and the manufacturing and assembly workforce as we decarbonize goods movement. So next slide. Just wanted to touch on a federal effort that CalSTAR's helping to lead that is trying to advance this conversation at the federal level on zero-emission truck incentives. So the National Zero-Emission Truck Coalition has been around for just a little bit over a year, actually, this week. And it's a good group of folks across the heavy-duty OEM supply chain, a few fleets, a few utilities, and other great stakeholders in the NGO community, for example, and others in the supply chain, the charging community, trying to advance the point of sale conversation, and what's, obviously and understandably a light duty kind of tax credit focused debate in Washington, D.C. And we want to kind of bust out of that mold. We want to talk about monetization quite a bit, and we want to talk about some ways of getting there. So we've organized around a cash in lieu of investment tax credit and point of sale incentive. So we think that could move quite a bit of trucks by the end of the decade over a 10-year incentive, as we've modeled it out, nearly 500,000 trucks, resulting in a lot of emissions reductions based on light-duty car equivalents removed from the road, and a lot of direct and indirect jobs across the supply chain. But you might be asking, why are we talking about investment tax credits? You were just talking about point of sale and then vouchers. How does that match up? We're kind of taking a hybrid between a voucher and an investment tax credit on the purchase side, and kind of molding those two together. So the investment tax credit being based on generally the amount of the incremental cost of that vehicle, that medium or heavy duty truck, and then monetizing that investment tax credit. So you're not waiting until the end of the tax period, but you're providing that benefit not at the point of purchase, but close to the point of purchase. So the model that we've used is the federal government has moved monetized tax credits within 60 days in the past. So we're kind of operating off of a 60-day threshold. So it's a lot better than waiting to the end of the tax period. We know that window's there to be getting that cash payment in lieu of ITC. So the other point real quick is that there is an option here to open this credit up to public fleets as well. So that I know it's an important point. Folks without tax interaction, how would that work? And there is, we've explored with Congress some mechanisms to transfer that tax liability if folks don't have it themselves to the dealer or to even the manufacturer to then be able to claim that credit as they're making the purchase. So there's some creative ways to open this up to public fleets, even though it's a tax credit. Next slide is just a quick snapshot of the Zero Emission Truck Coalition membership, and a lot of the partners here are actually run-on-less. I saw a couple of different run-on-less partners involved, DHL, I saw Volvo, BYD, and a number of others. So good amount of overlap between the folks that are working with us in DC to help advance this. And then last slide, just really quickly, just the legislative outlook on where things are. We were really encouraged to see the Biden-Harris administration put forth a monetized zero-emission medium heavy-duty vehicle credit proposal in their latest budget request a couple of weeks back. And so this is targeted to incremental costs, so ranging from $25,000 to $120,000, Class 3 to Class 8, based on duty cycle. There's some variation there, but generally incremental costs based starting in 22, stepping down through 2027. And most importantly, fleets could elect it as a cash payment in lieu of the credit. So really closely aligned with the National Zero Emission Truck Coalition's proposal and the most aggressive incentive we've seen in DC yet. And where that stands right now, Congress is considering a couple different approaches. The Senate has moved out on a 30% purchase side investment tax credit that doesn't have that monetization included. Does that change now that the administration has put forth a proposal? It's a little bit unclear. And House Ways and Means, they're updating their Green Act, which is the bill that's been around last Congress and this Congress, including all EV tax incentives, light duty, used EV tax credit, and infrastructure tax credits. Also a heavy duty, medium heavy duty credit that they're thinking about updating, and we're in the process of working through and educating on what the administration's proposal says, what the coalition's proposal has said, and why monetization is super important when we're designing these things. So a lot of question marks in Congress as they move forward on the American Jobs Plan and stimulus and EV tax credit legislation in general, but good signal from the White House. And I think that's a good example of how states have advanced the point of sale and monetization of these incentives for zero emission commercial vehicles in DC. So encourage folks to get in touch if you're interested more in the coalition, and we can provide more detail offline as well. So that's just a quick update, and I can turn it back to the group.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kyle, for that update. It's really exciting to hear all of this momentum at the federal level, and certainly hearing some themes here on the need for and effectiveness of these sort of cash on hood incentives available to fleets, or hopefully soon available to fleets, as is the case at the federal level. Up next, we are going to hear from Jess Daw with Natural Resources Canada, who has the audacious task of telling us what is happening in Canada, both at the federal and the provincial level, and what incentives are available for fleets north of the border. So Jess, over to you.
Thanks, Jesse. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm in Canada. I work in our Clean Fuels branch for Natural Resources Canada, relatively new branch created just under a year ago to advance Canada's low carbon fuels and production. And within that branch, I work in our fuels diversification division, and I work on medium and heavy duty vehicle decarbonization. Of course, that topic spans the whole of government. So I do work with colleagues in Transport Canada, Environment Climate Change Canada, and others. And before I start my presentation, I did just want to acknowledge I work in Victoria, BC, which is on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen and the WSÁNEĆ peoples. Next slide, please. Perfect. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson. It won't be too deep, because I know a lot of you are in the US. I just want to give a brief overview that will set the stage for covering all of Canada and the provinces. So in 2016, Canada's first ever national climate plan, Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, was developed. And that was an important first step to achieve the Paris Agreement targets. But in this past December, the government introduced its Strengthen Climate Plan, and that builds on the efforts that are currently underway. And I just pulled out a few key highlights here, and you can look at them after with the presentation, because I thought they were relevant to folks. Next slide. I just wanted to jump right into programs and support for electrification, which is what you're all here for today. A key program is our Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program that is offered by Natural Resources Canada, and it's aimed at supporting the deployment of EV chargers and hydrogen refueling stations across Canada. In a nutshell, ZEVIP looks to increase capacity and convenience, ensuring that charging is available where it's needed most. You'll see reference there in green to an upcoming RFP medium and heavy duty vehicle fleets. Since I submitted my slides to Jesse and folks, that RFP has since gone live or will be live any moment. And if you're looking for it, it's going to be called the Special Projects for On-Road and Off-Road Commercial and Public Fleets. So even if you're not in Canada, you might just be curious about how that program is structured. Next slide. Thank you. Another program that might be of interest to all of you is our Zero Emission Vehicle Awareness Initiative, or ZEVI. And you'll find information at the ZEVI website about upcoming calls for proposals. ZEVI supports new or innovative projects that aim to address awareness and knowledge gaps among Canadians when it comes to zero-emission vehicles. And that includes battery electric in all vehicle and equipment classes, including medium and heavy duty on road. So definitely keep your eyes on ZEVI. The other three programs I have here, they're not particular to zero-emission vehicles, but it is a suite of training, tools, and resources to help Canadian fleets lower their fuel consumption, operating costs, and vehicle emissions. There are, of course, many other programs and initiatives happening at the federal level, including some really cool ones that support the demonstration of charging infrastructure along with programming to test the safety and driving performance of new tech. But I don't have time to touch on those in today's little overview. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Next slide. Outside of programs, I did want to speak briefly to a key initiative to achieving Canada's 2030 climate targets that is relevant to electric vehicles. That's the clean fuel regulations, specifically the clean fuel standard, similar to California's low carbon fuel standard. And this regulation will make gasoline and diesel fuel cleaner, and it will also reduce pollution from transportation. And the proposed regulations, they're going to require fuel suppliers to reduce the carbon intensity of the fossil fuels that they produce and import. And so what's the relevancy for electric trucks? Well, it's when we look at the credit market that the proposed regulations will establish that this becomes apparent. Essentially, anyone who installs an electric charging station on their property or where they have the right to can generate credits. And this would apply to heavy-duty EVs as outlined in the proposed regulations, section 87.1, if anyone wants to look that up. Bottom line is that while conventional fuels like diesel are going to be required to reduce their carbon intensity under the regulation and the standard, there are opportunities for credits for clean fuels. Next slide. Just wanted to quickly say when talking about federal initiatives, because I would be remiss if I did not mention Canada's hydrogen strategy. We see hydrogen as a key pathway to achieve Canada's goal of net zero by 2050. And now, next slide, I want to move along to specific regions in Canada and how they're supporting electric freight vehicles. On the west coast of Canada, and where one of the Run on Less runs will be taking place, we have BC, who have their Clean BC Climate Plan, and it includes a variety of initiatives to support electric vehicles, including trucks, and I've pulled out a few for you. The first one, the SUVI program, aims to reduce GHG emissions from the transportation sector by incenting commercial zero-emission vehicles through post-purchase rebates. Another relevant program is the Commercial Vehicle Pilots program, and it has two main components. The first one is funding, support towards project costs for eligible vehicles, and the supporting infrastructure. And the second component is collection of data. There are other programs in BC which could be applicable to folks in our audience, so if you are interested, I encourage you to check out the BC website for more information. Next slide. Moving to the east, bringing you on a tour of Canada, skipped a lot of provinces, but this is where it just so happens that the second Canadian run is happening, and that's Quebec. Quebec's long been a leader in the electrification of transportation, and I've just pulled out a few programs to showcase this. I won't go into specifics of all of these, but I think it's helpful for people outside of Quebec, outside of Canada, to know about the variety of support and programming that's offered. In its plan for a green economy last fall, Quebec set out plans and actions that underpinned electrification as a priority and outlined key measures and financing for charging stations and for the electrification of school buses, trucks, rail, and marine transport. Zooming in on programs particular to transport for what we're looking at today, some of you might be familiar with Écoménage, and that is a commercial freight subsidy program. And it's my understanding that this program was allocated new money, so do stay tuned for news on that. Under the plan for green economy, there will also be an infrastructure strategy, which I'm told is currently in development. And so I encourage you to explore all of those further. Next slide, please. Of course, the decarbonization of transport, it's more than a national, provincial, or state endeavor, right? It's an international one too. And at Natural Resources Canada, we're involved in a number of initiatives. One that many of you are likely familiar with is Drive to Zero. Canada was the first country to sign the Drive to Zero pledge that was designed to catalyze the growth of electric and zero emission MHDVs. So we're actively involved in this campaign and others through the Clean Energy Ministerial. Next slide. I couldn't talk about electric freight without talking about Canadian companies and innovation that are truly supporting the electrification of the sector. This is just a teeny tiny snapshot, as there are many more companies in Canada leading the way. And overall, the Canadian government supporting innovation, jobs, and economic growth in our MHDV industry through its Sustainable Development Technology Canada, through the Strategic Innovation Fund, and through policy measures. And of note, Canada recently invested in Lion Electric's new battery manufacturing plant in Quebec. As a battery, it's the most expensive component of an electric vehicle, so this new manufacturing capability will have a direct impact on the development of heavy-duty electric transportation. My last slide here, just wanted to say that that was a very brief, truncated overview of what's happening across Canada and Canada itself when it comes to available incentives and different forms of support for electric vehicles. And although this covered national and provincial, there are cities and regions across Canada who also are supporting MHDVs, and there could be different ways they are doing that at the local level. So I definitely encourage you to, if that's relevant to you, to check that out. And then of course, this is along with your utility, which is going to be your first call anyways, of course. So don't need to remind you, but oftentimes when talking about available incentives at the provincial and federal level, it's important to remember the utilities themselves. And that's it for me. Thanks. Over to you, Jesse, and our next presenter.
Thank you so much, Jess. You just covered a ton of great information, and honestly, it's just so inspiring to see the leadership out of Canada and its provinces. And as you mentioned, that's not even it. So thank you for sharing that with the audience. Last but not least, we are going to hear from Joel Dunham from CTE, who's going to tell us a little bit about, particularly from a fleet perspective, if you're hearing about all of these different types of incentives available at different geographies and for different things, how do you really make sense of that and think about where it makes sense for your fleet to deploy these vehicles? So without further ado, Joel, over to you.
So unlike kind of some of the previous presentations, a lot of the work we do at CTE, and I'm sure the other organizations, is more focused on actually implementing these vehicles and planning out what that's going to look like and really figuring out how we're going to make all this stuff work. And one thing that really comes up into that is really understanding the relative influence of all these incentives and what they sort of pencil out with in terms of the overall business case of these efforts. So want to kind of look at that, because one piece of input we get from some of our nationwide partners, like UPS or like Anheuser-Busch or someone like that, is really sort of knowing that it really does cost quite a bit different depending on where you put these things into service. So I wanted to kind of go through what those differences look like and really kind of what to focus on for looking at your incentive program. So to do that, we did a little bit of a case study. So can you get the next slide? Okay, so really what we want to look at is the impact of incentives in these different cases. This is pretty streamlined, not intended to capture everything. We did want to highlight some of the types of incentives we've been talking about. So what we did was we evaluated the life cycle costs of 3 different markets, deploying a truck in those markets to gauge the relative impact of these different incentives. We didn't want to get into grants and things like that are really kind of competitive and can kind of come and go depending on funding availability. So really wanted to focus on sort of the more longer term available incentives. So for this case study, we looked at San Francisco as kind of an example of a market with a low electricity rate. This is actually an incentive in and of itself. They actually have passed through Pacific Gladstein Electric an incentive rate that is permanent. So it's not, it is an incentive, but it is a permanent rate that will be on board for the foreseeable future to make it feasible to run these vehicles more cost effectively. They also have high incentives, some of the things we've already been talking about in terms of HVIP and Lcfs and so on, as well as a charging infrastructure program offered through the utility. So really kind of hitting a lot of those points is that these things oftentimes start with the utility. Then we will look at Shreveport in Louisiana, which does have pretty low electricity costs, but also low incentives. So you really see kind of just the difference of the market dynamics of looking at, you know, what the base level intrinsic costs of operations are without any incentives. And then look at sort of, you know, your unsubsidized high electricity cost market, you know, in the Cleveland area. These are just sort of indicative, so don't take any of these to the bank, but just kind of wanted to give a sense on what the overall costs shake out like. So go to the next page. I'm not going to go rehash too many of this because we're kind of getting tight on time and we've covered it in quite a bit of detail. You did want to focus on the Lcfs credit program because that's something Jess highlighted, but you know, it's definitely a very lucrative incentive that a lot of folks don't consider when approaching these vehicles on the upfront or you know, from the front end, because it is sort of an operational cost. It doesn't come up with these cash in the hood programs and stuff like that, but it is worth considering in your long-term business case. One additional thing that may come up operationally is some markets allow access to HOV lanes or carpool lanes for some commercial EVs, vans and smaller trucks generally. But you know, I don't know if this is something we generally consider in the overall incentive picture, but it's something that can really provide an operational benefit, you know, if your market will provide that. Okay, next slide, please. So as an engineer, I had to make a graph. So what we did is, you know, compared these three markets side by side and stacked up the effective cost of the truck after the incentive. In this case, we modeled HVIP. Then the effective charger cost after the any charging equipment incentives you get there. This is just the charger itself. We didn't get into the infrastructure part, which is, you know, really site dependent. And so I didn't want to get into that, but this right here, for the sake of this quick demonstration, is just the charger itself. And then on top of that, the energy costs. The hashed area represents that Lcfs revenue. And so really what this is functionally is that you get a, you know, money back for every kilowatt hour of energy that you put into your truck. And really that does, you know, significantly offset the operating cost there. I mean, what you're really seeing here is a negative cost per mile for energy because you're generating more Lcfs revenue than you're paying for that that unit of electricity. But overall, you know, what we see is that the purchase vouchers are a really big deal. These trucks are very expensive, and it's, you know, being able to realize some savings on those, you know, in this case, saved 15% of the overall life cycle cost. So, you know, we do kind of get distracted on all the different elements on there, but really, you know, purchase vouchers and grants where available are super helpful. But, you know, electricity rates are really a close second. You know, we didn't do this super scientifically, but, you know, even within this limited sample, the, you know, really exceptionally beneficial rate from PG&E reduced costs 14%, but even just sort of the natural difference between the Shreveport utility rate and the Cleveland utility rate saved 8%. So even just by, you know, identifying and evaluating your charging costs, you know, up front can really identify, you know, markets if you have that latitude that can reduce that cost. I will also say that you know, we've harped a few times on coordinating with your utility, and we've found on several occasions when we present, you know, what we anticipate charging costs to be and whether or not that's going to work for an operator to the utility, that we've gotten a lot of traction with those folks and been able to identify, you know, solutions or at least policy objectives to bring down those charging costs through, you know, beneficial rates or different types of structures and so on. So you know, definitely want to call that out as we're talking about electricity rates. The next one is the Lcfs program, which I kind of teed up already. We're seeing a significant cost savings on that. And finally, charging programs, you know, it's significant, but it's not a huge part of the project. So charging programs can be helpful. You know, this is just kind of a credit or a voucher for your charger. There are other charging programs offered through utilities where they will pay for all of the installation infrastructure to the stub out that make it very cheap for you to install your charger. There are other programs where the utility will just own the charging equipment and really kind of just charge you a use fee on that. So there are other charging programs to look at, but over that, all that, you know, super helpful, but not, you know, the hugest part of the overall cost footprint of one of these projects. Okay, next slide. So overall, just kind of want to throw out some best practices in, the way to approach these projects and, where incentives fit in on that. The first thing is just to make sure the trucks are going to meet your needs, and definitely strongly encourage modeling or testing for this. There's a lot of, hype out there, a lot of a lot of marketing. But it's always important that they work in your context, because they are quite different depending on whether you're operating it in Alberta or Kentucky. So definitely want to make sure that you're considering that it'll work in your context. Then we want to look at anticipated costs. I mean, like we saw with the LCFS thing, those benefits come on later in life, and it's really helpful to anticipate all those costs so that you don't get surprised when you get this truck on the road and realize that it ends up costing you way more than you anticipated it would to operate. But then research incentives and kind of have a solid sense for what your costs are going to be, and then identify all those incentives out there. And I say that because it's a little bit scary to get overly excited about a big purchase incentive and then forget about actually what it's going to take to operate this vehicle. So I feel like it's very important to really have a good solid sense of what the total cost of doing this and how you're going to do this overall project before getting super excited about some incentive that gets you signed up for operational costs that were more than you could handle. And then finally, manage operations. As we, everything is moving at 1 million miles a minute in this industry, and things change. And so, we do all this planning up front to figure things out, but it's super important to actually monitor things in service to make sure that everything's working out the way you thought it would, and then you're not having any unanticipated, cost drivers or risks to your mission or anything like that, and identify continual opportunities for improvement. Then that's it for my discussion at this point.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joel. I know I speak for a lot of folks in the audience when I say it's just so helpful to see how this all really plays out in the real world. So we've got maybe about 5-6 minutes left for Q&A. I'm going to try to get to as many as possible in our limited time. We've got a lot of great questions come in from folks, both registration and live. So first, I'm going to kind of combine two groups of questions that we've got. Basically, they both boil down to fleets who are not necessarily super keen to get rid of their current vehicles yet. So questions around, one, are there any opportunities for repowers or retrofits? Victoria, I might go to you first, since I know you mentioned that was something you guys were thinking about in terms of future research. And then before I turn it over to you, another one, if you have anything you'd like to add, is a lot of questions around why is scrappage a requirement for so many of these incentive programs? Fleets who need to prove that they've scrapped an old internal combustion engine vehicle in order to qualify for these new incentives. And are there opportunities for folks who maybe just want to expand their fleet or just test this new electric truck before they get rid of their existing vehicles? So scrappage, repowers, retrofits, any thoughts on that, Victoria? Like I said, I'll turn it over to you first.
Sure. So very briefly, NJZIP doesn't have a universal scrappage requirement. We do allow folks to expand their fleet or augment their fleet, or if they have a vehicle that is younger than engine model year 2009, then they don't have to scrap at all. They can resell it, even if they're doing a direct replacement. One of the biggest reasons for scrappage is because, in model year 2009, there were a lot of new standards that came out, and that's why we've drawn the line there, where we're trying to get the dirtiest diesel off the road. So that's a short answer on NJZIP. We saw that it was a challenge in other programs, and we're hoping that that'll open it up for folks in New Jersey. For repowers and retrofits, it's something that we're looking into, as I noted. One of the reasons we didn't include it in the pilot was being able to do the validation is a little bit more challenging, that they're designed appropriately and retrofitted appropriately. So we wanted to start sort of with whole solutions, so that we wouldn't be worried about validating each retrofitter, but it's something we're looking into because there are certainly folks who have appreciated wanting to maintain their old vehicle. One thing we have heard back, though, from people who have adopted zero-emission vehicles, they're getting to do their test drives right now, or they haven't gotten their final ones, is that there's a really big difference in the driving, that It takes a little bit of getting used to, but a lot of folks have reported back after about a week being like, oh, I like this a lot more. So there's also just a barrier to entry a little bit there, just an educational opportunity. So we're looking at ways to get people in, butts in the seats, get people in these vehicles and have them feel what they feel like, because there's just lack of familiarity. So hopefully that's helpful.
Very helpful. Thank you. Anyone else want to add anything on the retrofit repower scrappage topic?
Yeah, I can just
Yeah, I
jump
mean, it
in.
definitely. Oh, go for it, Jess.
I was just going to jump in from Canada and say that there absolutely are retrofits, and I highlighted our Green Freight Assessment Program at the federal level, but there also are in different provinces, so I won't go into each of them, but BC has one, Manitoba, Quebec, and Newfoundland and Labrador. So there definitely are ways to tackle the fleet that are on the road today, reduce emissions, and also increase fuel efficiency. So definitely are opportunities and funding and support available.
Awesome. Joel?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, in the class 4 space, many of those manufacturers are repowering vehicles and selling them as new. I mean, a lot of the new electric vehicles are repowers. So, it's not a crazy idea by any stretch. It has happened, and it's part of kind of the new market already in that sense.
Excellent. Thank you. So our next question, Joel, I'm going to throw this over to you actually, is we've talked a lot today about how there is this price premium on electric trucks, and yes, there are these incentives to help cover that, oftentimes a one-time kind of incentive. But you mentioned, like with LCFS, for example, that there are some new revenue streams that electric trucks present to fleets. And I'm curious if there are any other sort of new revenue streams that fleets should be thinking about with respect to their electrification plan.
I mean, I think the one thing that is a little bit of a, an expectation of the industry is, and one thing that really a lot of fleet operators are really kind of prioritizing is a reduced maintenance cost. So again, it's not necessarily a revenue stream, but, it could potentially see a significant benefit to their operations, because a lot of local delivery operations never get their trucks up to a speed to regenerate their diesel particulate filters, and so they become a real maintenance nightmare. And so a lot of the current electric trucks are ideally suited for those applications and can drastically reduce the maintenance costs associated with those operations. And so that's still kind of an open question as to whether that's going to pay out, because the confounding force on those is that these are all very new trucks, and with that, they're still working some things out in the design and so on. So maintenance isn't a definite slam dunk yet, but within the next couple of years, we're seeing that could be a real benefit for the business case on a lot of these things, is the ability to not have to pay so much attention to those diesel emissions controls.
Excellent, thank you. And I'll add from our end, I know, while maybe not an incentive, there are some innovative financing models happening available to fleets, and we're going to be covering that a bit more in our 7th session. So a month from today, we'll be talking more about that. Maybe one last quick Q&A around economic development, workforce development. I know a few of you, Jess, Victoria, covered this a bit in your presentations. I'm curious, anyone have anything to add in terms of how we're thinking about what these incentives and trucking electrification in general means for workforce development opportunities, economic development, particularly for these regions offering incentives? Anyone want to jump in?
I can just quickly jump in there. I know we're short on time. It's a great question, because incentives are really important for reducing the sticker shock and enabling and stimulating purchases. But across the full value chain, there's opportunity when it comes to electrification of vehicles. So you've got from the mining of the metals for the batteries, which are often in rural or remote areas. So it's providing jobs in those areas, to the manufacturing of the vehicles themselves, to the infrastructure, and then the installation of the EV infrastructure by skilled trades folks. We're really seeing how zero emission technology can create jobs, good jobs all over. And I did highlight in my presentation an example that I think speaks to that, which is the recent investment in the battery plant, Lion Electric's battery plant by Canada and Quebec. And that's going to lead to 135 jobs once it's completed. And it really underscores the importance of investing in manufacturing and how that will accelerate the country's decarbonization of transportation overall.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, Victoria, you want to jump in real quick?
Yeah, I was just going to flag that one of the interesting problems I think is that there's a lot of folks, as Jess noted, that already are skilled tradespeople, but that there's not necessarily a universal certification that a lot of companies feel comfortable with saying, okay, this person is clearly skilled in putting charging installations in the ground or can do the maintenance on this vehicle. And so one of the ways we're looking at economic development is how do we partner with unions and educational institutions and training institutions that already exist to define certifications and standards for folks to use the skills they already have in a new way. So really helping that transition without, necessarily creating something new, but utilizing what we already have to pursue that economic growth.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you, first of all, to all of our speakers. This was great. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the team will be out in force this fall talking through a lot of these issues in more depth. So we invite you to join us there. Thank you to all of you for dialing in. Thank you to all the Run on Less sponsors who allow us to make this bootcamp series possible. And if you could please take a moment and fill out the survey you see on your screen. We really appreciate any feedback. Lastly, just to note, we are offering quizzes. If you want to test your knowledge of all this great content we've heard today, you can go to runonless.com and take a quiz on each bootcamp. So today's would be number 5. And our next training will be 2 weeks from today. We'll actually be talking more about just this issue Victoria and Jess just touched on around training, as well as maintenance and safety, what this really looks like to move the industry forward. So thank you all again. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.